For the third and final part of our look at Namco's arcade titles, we're starting in 1993 and going all the way up to 1999, where there's a whole lot more classics to look at. Of course, a lot of the games that we're going to be looking at are 3D, which shouldn't be a surprise. In this period, two companies basically lorded it over everyone else when it came to 3D in the arcade. One was Sega, with their Model 1, 2 and 3 boards. We've already covered the exceptional work that they did there in the past, and Namco was the other one. We've already seen the majority of titles they released on their System 21 polygonizer hardware, but they'll reach even greater heights with the System 22 and 23 boards, not to mention System 11 and 12. Those were the boards that were based on PlayStation hardware. So you can expect to see a whole load of famous games here. If you spent any time in arcades back in the mid-late 90s, you're likely going to know a whole load of these, and a lot of them also come inside some truly iconic cabinets. There's plenty to get through, so let's not waste any more time and get straight into 1993. We're firing our engines up with the original Air Combat. This game doesn't bear a massive amount of relation to the likely more famous series of console titles that followed it, but it's still a pretty impressive combat flight game for the time, one that's pushing the System 21 to its absolute limits, so much so that it is still classified as not working in MAME. As it is, the game is largely playable, however there are certainly some major issues with the graphics. A fair few of the arcades we'll be seeing in this vid concentrate on short yet highly impressive experiences, and Air Combat is the first of these. The goal here is simply to eliminate 6 enemy planes inside of a minute, and the type of plane you're facing depends on the difficulty you've picked. You only face one plane at a time, so it's essentially 6 rapid dogfights, with the tangos whizzing around and trying to evade your missiles. A lot of the experience would, of course, come from a tremendous environmental cap. Look at all that detail, a thing of beauty. There was also a smaller, compact version of the game. Certainly less impressive, but presumably a cheaper option. Cyber Sled is another System 21 game. In fact, it's the last one we're going to be looking at in the video before Namco do their big hardware upgrade. Once again, this game can be a bit sketchy in MAME and is classed as not working. It is at least playable for a time, however it will very likely crash at some point. This is a 3D tank game that's all about one-on-one combat. You've got a gun as well as some missiles, you dive in and out of cover, sap the enemy's health bar, collect refills and the like. It's pretty entertaining. Is it as glorious and as deep as something like Sega's Virtual On titles? Perhaps not. Although to be fair, this was released a couple of years before that series started. You do get a few different vehicles to choose from, as well as the choice between the regular mode and training, which is nice, and on the whole it's a neat little title with a little bit of a learning curve, as opposed to being something like the last game that is a bit more of a theme park ride. While this game is a bit rickety in MAME, Cyber Sled did get a worldwide port to the PlayStation in 1995. Obviously not quite as strong graphically, although it does add some more vehicles into the mix.
Missiles.
Now of course, not everything in this video is going to feature polygons. We've still got plenty of nice 2D stuff to look at, and we start here with Emeraldia. This takes us into puzzle game territory for some classic chucking gems down the well action, with the twist being that you have to crack blocks before you can then make them disappear. You crack blocks by creating a column of 3 identically coloured emeralds, at which point you can then remove them from the well by placing another block of the same colour next to them, either vertically, horizontally or diagonally. It might take a couple of goes to get your head around this concept, but it's a pretty nice puzzler once it does click, and it does have a couple of different modes to go through. Once you play the regular mode for a bit and the mechanics of the game make sense, there's a versus mode as well as an adventure mode to look at. It's all quite lovely. One other thing we'll certainly be seeing a lot of? Baseball games. Yep, there's plenty more of these. We actually start here with something a little different to the normal Super World Stadium antics. This is Great Sluggers, New World Stadium. The main difference between this and Super World Stadium is that Great Sluggers is a bit more realistic when it comes to player proportions and all of that. It's trying to be more normal on that front. Aside from that, well, it doesn't play all that differently to the Super World Stadium titles. The thing about these games is that by this point I have played so many of them that by now I'm at least able to be a bit more competent at them, able to judge the timing on the batting really well, and even fare a little better in the pitching and fielding departments that I normally always struggle with. Now, does this mean that I particularly like the title? Not a whole lot. Baseball games simply aren't my bag most of the time, but I do see why Namco made so frickin' many of them. They did sell. In this video, we are going to see Namco break a whole load of ground in the fighting game genre. Having had very little history in the genre beforehand, they'll be one of the leading lights in it by the decade's end. However, all of this is going to happen thanks to 3D titles that we'll be seeing later. It is not going to happen thanks to Knuckle Heads, a 2D fighter from Namco that almost no one remembers nowadays. Not that it's necessarily a bad game. This is of course one of many fighters that came out in the wake of Street Fighter 2's phenomenal success. Everyone had to have their own take on the genre, and this is Namco's. Every fighter here has a weapon, and there's a couple of other twists. You actually have a jump button as opposed to simply pushing up, and it is actually possible to have fights between more than 2 people. Now the jury's out when it comes to how well that actually works, but it's certainly novel. The actual fighting is largely based around charging up attacks by holding the buttons down, so it certainly does play a bit differently from a lot of the more generic fighters in the big old peloton that followed SF2 around. Not remembered at all, especially not when compared to the fighting games to come, but it's not that bad. Certainly better than other efforts by big studios that I could mention. Martial Champion. Here's one I have a lot of fond memories of. Lucky and Wild. This takes us into sprite scaling land, and it's a vehicular pursuit game a la Chase HQ, although the emphasis here is much more on shooting as opposed to ramming, as you pursue your perp and blast your gun at them in a big old movie-style shootout. The game's got tons of character and all sorts of one-liners, lovely graphics, and a pretty different sort of play, definitely one that wants a lot of love. Of course, it's also definitely a game that's designed for a duo, the sort of arcade that really promotes 2-player escapades and isn't the same at all without it. Lucky and Wild is playable with a single player, mind, which is kind of cool when it comes to the arcade cabinet. You've got one hand on the wheel, one's holding your gun, working the pedals with your feet. It's not ideal, but it certainly works. Alas, this can be perhaps too much of a challenge to get properly going in MAME. If, like me, you've only got the basic interfaces to work with, then trying to recreate the effects using a mouse and a gamepad just isn't going to cut it, because it kind of requires having a third hand. Not that this is the fault of the game in the slightest, of course. It's still a brilliant title, and I'm glad to have played it properly back in the day, because honestly, that's one of my best arcade memories.
Continue.
We do have a few more quiz games to look at, or at least point out and move on from very quickly. This one here is Nettou, Gekitou, Quizztou, which roughly translates to Hot Fighting, Fierce Fighting Quiz Island. And once again, there's all sorts of exotic cutscenes that all come in whenever you get past a series of questions. As ever, it's all Greek or rather Japanese to me, so we may as well move on. Arcade goers had already enjoyed waggling their joysticks and rapidly fingering their buttons for quite some time before our next game came out, but Numan Athletics here is another very fine entry into the track and field tradition. The twist here, as befits the name, is that the competitors are superhuman. So for instance, instead of doing a regular old 100-metre race, you'll be doing a sprint over several miles and outrunning a drag racer. Fun, eh? Actually, it is a lot of fun. The presentation is brilliant in this title, and it's not simply a matter of taking old traditional events and slapping a futuristic coat of paint on them. While having a regular old javelin replaced by hurling a missile about is fun, Numan Athletics shines with events such as Interceptor or Versus Express that are actually a fair bit more novel than the regular athletics norm. Damn fine stuff, and definitely worth a look if you're into this sort of thing. Right, here's a big title. Possibly one of the video's biggest, in fact. We've seen 3D games from Namco already, and plenty of them, but Ridge Racer is the game changer. The one that puts them right at the forefront, with the phenomenal success to match. Not just when it comes to arcade success, seeing as it was one of the world's biggest games in 1994, but as a killer app when it came to establishing the Sony PlayStation as the new console of choice for many people. The game already had a long history before its full arrival to the arcade. I briefly mentioned Unos Roadster in the second part of this look at Namco, an impressive attraction that could be seen at various Namco trade show stands and the like from 1990 onwards. Here you could sit inside a model of the Roadster, also known as the Mazda MX-5, and play a flat-shaded driving simulation that took place over 3 screens, a la Driver's Eyes. This machine still used the old System 21 hardware, but it was the next evolution that would mark the debut of System 22. Sim Drive from 1992. This featured both at expos and at Namco's amusement park, and, oh, well, it's beautiful. You've got an absolutely massive screen and a full-size shell of the Mazda MX-5 to race in. That and this is, of course, a different game already. We're not working with flat shades anymore, because we've got textures. Neither Unos Roadster nor SimDrive are available to us, sadly, but SimDrive is the prototype for what would become Ridge Racer, hitting the arcade floors in October 1993. This is pretty clearly a different kettle of fish to anything we've seen in 3D up to this point. Look at all those textures, look at all that speed. It is, of course, stunning. Once again, this game put Namco neck and neck with Sega. Ridge Racer hit the arcades a couple of months after Sega had begun testing for the equally exceptional Daytona USA, and they are definitely very comparable. That and Namco's hardware tended to be sold at a slightly cheaper price than the Model 2 that Sega was offering, and there wasn't a huge amount of difference between the two, at least when it comes to what the player sees as opposed to the inside workings. Now, of course, it helps that we've got a fabulous game in general. This is still a lovely racing title, filled with highly memorable presentation touches, all a commentary, a great track, and a beautifully slippy style of racing that's perfect for the arcades. You can't exactly go on here, and it deserved all of the success. It had plenty of different cabinets too. There's the usual sort of environmental cab and the like, which are already damn good, but then you have the more limited edition efforts, including one of the most amazing of them all, the Ridge Racer Full Scale cab, which is essentially a scaled down version of what you had with SimDrive that would cost an operator $250,000 back in 1993. Now, I've linked an amazing article in the description from the arcade blogger that goes through the story, in detail, of what is very possibly the last surviving example of the Ridge Racer full-scale cabinet in the entire world. That's definitely worth reading. Ridge Racer? Bluntly put, quite simply, marvellous. As always, there's a little bit of a come down as we go from covering such a landmark title to, well, a more straightforward sports game. But hey, there's actually a fair bit to enjoy about Super World Court. This is definitely better than the first tennis title that we saw back in part 2. It's a lot faster and smoother and more entertaining. It's very easy to get into some nice long rallies here, and that's appreciated. What's most interesting though is that there is a bit of kookiness. You can play on all the usual surfaces that you would expect, but there is also a slightly weirder one where all the officials and line judges are now variations of Pac-Man. Oh, and you can also play as a cat, foregoing the racket in favour of whacking the ball back with your paws. A tennis game where you can be a cat? Well, surely that's enough for the game to be considered perfect, isn't it? Anyway, this is quite amusing. In many ways, this feels like a forerunner to Smash Court Tennis, the series of much more light-hearted and arcadey tennis titles that Namco would have success with in the home. Oh, what? Just because Namco released a baseball game with more realistically proportioned players, you didn't think that they'd bother to release another Super World Stadium game? Ha, come on, wise up. Obviously, we're now playing Super World Stadium 93. And yeah, not an awful lot has changed. This is very much the same deal as before, complete with the same music and the graphics and all of that. The only difference is that, presumably, all the teams and rosters have been appropriately updated. I will let you in into something of a shock, however. We actually won't be seeing a Super World Stadium game in 1994. Just what does the future of Namco's baseball games look like? Well, you'll have to keep watching to find out. I'm sure you're on tenterhooks. With all the big buzz of 3D and the release of Rave Racer, there's something else that's becoming ever clearer. We're starting to reach the end of the road when it comes to the sprite scaler games. Sadly, they're now at the point where they are getting to be thought of as obsolete. However, they aren't going away without a final flourish. Namco have two of these coming, and the first is 1993's Suzuka 8 Hours 2. This is, of course, the motorcycle version of Final Lap, and while graphically this isn't an awful lot different to the first Suzuka 8 Hours, this does feature a choice of 4 tracks as opposed to one single Suzuka circuit. Naturally that's here, but you do have Green Hill, Bayside and Devil's Canyon chucked into the mix. With the exception of Suzuka, these tracks are totally original. As ever, you can't go too far on with this, especially if you're already a fan of Namco's racing titles. Seeing as they're one of the best to ever do it in the arcade, then this is just another damn fine title to add to that reputation. We start off 1994 with Namco on familiar ground, but evolved somewhat. Ace Driver is the next in a long line that goes back to pole position, then through Final Lap, Winning Run and Driver's Eyes. It's Namco and it's Formula 1 racing. While Ace Driver doesn't take place on the ever-familiar Suzuka circuit, it still gives you one fine track filled with adverts for other Namco games, the odd cheeky reference to the Namco Polygonizer hardware, and plenty of opportunities for blazing speed. And of course, as with so many other Namco racers, there's plenty of options for multiplayer. Operators could link up to 4 2-player cabs together for a maximum of 8 players at once. Ace Driver isn't exactly as well known these days as Rave Racer is. Perhaps surprisingly, it didn't get a port outside of the arcade, which might be a reason for that. However, it was another arcade hit for Namco. The US mag Next Generation did a bit of reporting on the game, and you might be surprised at just how many operators went all out to get the full 4-cabinet 8-player experience out of Ace Driver and other Namco games like it. It is yet another exceptional arcade racer. Up next, we've got Cyber Commando. The title may possibly clue you in that this is the sequel to Cyber Sled. We've got more tank battles in big old 3D arenas, complete with a bunch more vehicles to choose from, ranging from those that are familiar if you've played the original, to ones that are brand spanking new. The improved System 22 hardware definitely makes a big difference. This is undoubtedly a much better game in every single department than the original. Also, unlike the original, this one actually works fine in MAME, which is a bonus. This is another highly recommended game if you enjoy this sort of one-on-one action. Unfortunately, it's not exactly as well known as the original. There's no PS1 port here, and the game didn't actually leave Japan. As with the original title, this game can be a little tricky to get to grips with. Once you figure out the controls, you've got to try and find the best way to get a drop on your opponent and pelt them with a very limited supply of missiles, all while not leaving yourself utterly out in the open. It is very cool once you do get a handle on it though. Alas, this would be the last game in this short little 3D tank series, but it is a goodie. Speaking of the last game in a series, it's time for Namco to say goodbye to the sprite scalers and goodbye to the almighty Final Lap. Final Lap R, the R stands for Real, is the last entry in one of Namco's most successful ever series of games, but the team behind it are making sure they go out on a high. Everything about Final Lap has been overhauled, with new improved graphics and better controls to make this as big of a bang as possible. We are just about pushing sprite scaling to the limit with this one, and the smoothness of this game makes that pretty apparent. I mean, the only other scalar racing game I can think of that's comparable to this, technically speaking, is Capcom's Slipstream from 1995. It's great to see Final Lap ending with its best entry yet. Once again, you've got 4 courses to choose from, with the selection consisting of Germany, Hungary, Belgium and Brazil. Again, the tracks have different levels of difficulty, with Germany being the toughest Final Lap course of them all. Lots to be getting on with. Even if the sprite scalers had long had their day by the time this title came out, Final Lap R was still a success, primarily in Japan. Clearly the name was still strong, and it ends up being a great swan song for a style of arcade game that was so dominant back in the second half of the 1980s. Get your hot dogs and beers and all of that, cause it's baseball time again. Great Sluggers 94 New World Stadium is actually the only baseball game we're going to see this year. In fact, have Namco decided to bring the almighty Super World Stadium to an end in favour of this more realistic looking game, complete with, shock of horrors, real players from Major League Baseball? Well, I suppose we'll have to see. Much like the first one, Great Sluggers 94 is a fine enough baseball game. The presentation has definitely taken a significant boost, especially when you consider that Super World Stadium has basically been the exact same game released over and over for the last couple of years, and it does play nice and all of that. I can't exactly find a whole lot of fault in it really, especially when compared to some of Namco's earlier baseball titles. Baseball fans may want to throw a knuckleball at this game, or give it a bunt, or do a change-up and give this a try, or, I don't know, insert your favourite shitty baseball puns here. We're still in Sportsland, and we're going to the world of football, or, you know, soccer. Again, it's funny, Namco have been kicking around the arcades for ages, and usually it doesn't take too long for big studios to chuck a footy game onto the floor. But in the case of Namco, it's actually taken them until here in 1994, and the arrival of the J-League in Japan finally entices them to make and release J-League Soccer V-Shoot. Although, as the title might suggest, this game only came out in Japan. Once again, it's a title that's very true to the norm. Side-on arcade football, much like Football Champ or Super Sidekicks, complete with all the teams and all these samba drums that you'll find in any J-League based game from this time. It's not a standout title by any stretch of the imagination, in other words, although the gameplay is perfectly okay. Don't worry, we do have other much more original games to move on to, and we will be getting there very soon. We've got another bout of vertical shooting action. Not the most famous one that Namco have ever released, but it's not too bad. This is Nebulas Ray. This is something of a successor to the earlier Fighter and Attacker, seeing as most of the same team worked on both games, although I would say that the earlier title is actually better here. The main gimmick of Nebulas Ray is something that you kind of expect to see a bit of from this era, and it often hasn't aged all that well. It uses loads of pre-rendered sprites, and while that certainly wowed crowds back in the day, yeah, it does look a bit flat now, with not a lot going on in the way of animation. It's a perfectly average shoot 'em up in the end, but there's an awful lot of games like this kicking around, and to be blunt, there's not a whole lot that really makes Nebulas Ray shine compared to so many other titles. '94 has been a bit bland in the world of Namco so far, but don't worry, The year is going to end very strongly indeed, and it starts here with another one of their highly successful and justifiably famous titles, one that is still a big attraction in the arcades to this day. It's Point Blank. The adventures of Dr. Dan and Dr. Don still make for one of the definitive casual light gun games ever made. It's everything from a breath of fresh air compared to all sorts of other light gun titles that deal in all sorts of blood and guts, to another highly important title that, again, sets Namco on the way towards leading the pack in a new genre. We have seen fine shooting galleries from them already, particularly with the likes of Golly Ghost, but this is another level. The appeal of this game, especially as a competitive two-player blast, goes without saying. There's so many entertaining and very comedic levels that test everything from how quickly you can hammer that trigger to how accurate you can be with a single shot. But what tends to get overlooked a bit is that this is the first game to feature what is surely the greatest arcade light gun ever made. Now, while it didn't officially get this name until it arrived on the PlayStation, for simplicity's sake we will call it the GunCon. A frankly perfect instrument with just the right look, the right weight, and especially the right recoil. While the GunCon is probably more associated with a title we'll be seeing next year, it did debut here on the arcade Point Blank, and the flawlessness of this device goes a long way towards making this game great, whether here or on the PlayStation, where it actually took until 1997 for Point Blank to get ported. 30 years have passed, and if you're in an arcade that's got Point Blank, well, chances are you are still going to have to queue up for it. For what it is, it's a perfect game. We're going back to Ridge City. It's no surprise to see Ridge Racer 2 come so quickly after the first title. While this is another one of those sequels that's much more like an update, it does make a few very important changes. On the surface, you may not notice too many of them. The HUD is a bit different, the game's added a rear view mirror, there's different and remixed music, it's all that sort of thing. By and large, this is still the same track from the original. But of course, the big difference is the one that you don't see when you're in MAME. Whereas the original Ridge Racer was a single player only game, this brings Ridge Racer into the Namco tradition of linked up cabinets, where you can link up as many as 4 2-player cabs for a maximum of 8 racers going at it. Doing this was very important indeed. Sega's Daytona USA was Ridge Racer's main competitor, and the biggest edge that Daytona had over Ridge Racer was that it had that link-up capability with up to 8 players, whereas the original Ridge Racer could only have 1. With the release of Ridge Racer 2 in June of '94, both games are now basically neck and neck. In the end, they are both stone-cold classics that are equally lovable, but back then the competition was most certainly fierce. Which one did you prefer? Those big hits? Yep, they most certainly keep on coming. The competition between Ridge Racer and Daytona USA is one thing, but now we have the competition between Sega's Virtua Fighter and Namco's brand new 3D Fighter. At first, when previewed by mags who'd seen it at expos, such as 1994's AMOA show, it was known as Rave War, but on release it would become known to everybody as Tekken. It's everyone's introduction to the fine practice of throwing your firstborn off a mountain to see if he's strong enough to inherit control of your clan. It was designed after Namco had poached a few of Virtua Fighter's creators from Sega, particularly Seiichi Ishii, and it is once again another stupidly important title. Not just for being the start of another massive series, but for being another big grab for the PlayStation early on. As successful an arcade game as the original Tekken is, it is also, in an odd way, a harbinger of the bad things to come for the arcade, and that's largely down to the hardware that powers it. As detailed in a 1995 feature in Edge magazine, the game was originally supposed to be made using System 22 hardware, but a meeting with Sony head honcho Ken Kutaragi and a discussion of what was going to be in the PlayStation led to the creation of the System 11 board, hardware that is very much based around the console, and Tekken would be the first System 11 game. And so Tekken was available in basically arcade-perfect form on the PS1 mere months after it arrived in arcades, with the result being that it would be, according to the Guinness Book of Records, the first PS1 game to sell over 1 million copies. The fighting, the characters, the play, I mean, they don't need too much of an introduction, of course. We will have a good few other Tekken entries to really get into that, but when you compare it to its main competitor, Sega's Virtua Fighter 2, well, it's not quite as good looking. Indeed, you would perhaps say it is just that little bit worse in all departments, but that's hardly bad considering it's running on far cheaper hardware. It is very, very competitive. Virtua Fighter 2 would still be more successful, particularly in Japan, but Tekken already wasn't that far away from it. Even if this is the first game of many in the series, and probably the one that people are least inclined to play today considering how far Tekken has come, Namco's fighter hit the ground running. We've got one more game from 1994, and it's another really damn good one. However, this might actually be one you're not that aware of. Tinkle Pit is an absolute old-school treasure of a game, a single-screen maze where you drag a ball about. You hold the line button down, make as big a line as possible, and then release it to smash up any enemy that happens to be in its path. And you can also fire a couple of projectiles. Damn near all the enemies are from other Namco games. In the main, you've got Pukas and Fire Guards from Dig Dug, as well as other guys from Toy Pop, whereas power-ups will also turn you into something Namco related, whether it be Pac-Man or Silverloo or the Galachip, all sorts. There's tons upon tons of references here, but crucially they're all bundled into an absolutely wonderful game. Very pretty, very playable, one that's hard to put down once you start playing. Tinkle Pit only ever came out in Japanese arcades, which is a shame because it is unquestionably one of the best Namco arcade games that you have very likely never heard of. Sure, the game's title may sound slightly like a nickname for a toilet, but ignore that and go play the game now if you haven't. It's a proper arcade gem. We're now in 1995, and once again we're taken to the skies. Air Combat 22 is, as you might expect, the sequel to the original Air Combat. You may have thought that Air Combat 2 might have been a more suitable name for the game, but it's called 22 as a reference to the System 22 hardware that powers it. In fact, I believe that this is one of the first games to use an upgraded version of Namco's hardware called the Super System 22, one that's capable of chucking a bunch more polygons and special effects onto the screen. The aim of this game is largely the same as the first, in that you're mainly taking on enemy planes in dogfights that can vary wildly depending on the difficulty you've chosen, although naturally we've got a lot more detail and the fights actually do feel a fair bit more complex in terms of what both you and the old bogey can do. Plus you'll eventually end up in some sort of big old boss battle at the end, usually against something like an aircraft carrier. This is the last time we'd see Air Combat in the arcade, but there's plenty here that would go on to influence the series in the home. The first Air Combat game would hit the PS1 a few months after this game's release, and it would be pretty successful there. This is obviously the game to go for if you want to play an arcade version, not least because this actually works properly in MAME, unlike the original.
I'm hit! I'm hit! Last one, middle of the way! I'm hit! I'm hit!
Namco continues to push boundaries when it comes to environmental cabs, particularly those of the body motion variety. As we continue on, we'll see more games of that vein that aren't just limited to the racing track. Here, for example, we have Alpine Racer. This is a game that I have lots of memories of, a big old cabinet that invited you to climb up, get your feet on those big ski controls, and get moving down the piste. I must say I can't recall ever being that good at it, but it certainly was a laugh for the 2 or 3 minutes that it lasted. Now, this is obviously a pretty tough one to recreate here in MAME. The controls are quite exotic, and I haven't really found a way to make the title workable. Unfortunately, this is going to be the case with a few games of this sort that we'll be seeing. Still, just seeing this game does bring back a lot of fond memories. This was certainly still an area where the arcades provided something that you absolutely could not get in the home. But, of course, we've still got lots of racing games. Namco pushed out so many of the damn things, you may well find a bunch that aren't remembered that well at all nowadays. Something like Cybercycles, for example, obviously doesn't hold the same sort of name recognition that a classic like Ridge Racer does. This is, as you might expect, the 3D System 22 successor to the Suzuka 8 Hours line. You get on your bike and lean all over the shop, potentially play against your mates, and you do have 2 different circuits to choose from, as well as several different flavours of motorcycle. As ever, it's perfectly enjoyable, even if it perhaps lacks a little bit of the personality that you find in something like Ridge Racer. I think a sequel to this one would have had a good chance of being a proper humdinger, but in the end this was the only Cybercycles game. You've seen Ridge Racer, you've seen Ridge Racer in a Formula 1 car, and you've just seen Ridge Racer on 2 wheels. Now, here's Ridge Racer Off-Road Edition. This is Dirt Dash, a game that sticks you in jeeps and largely replaces the clean surroundings of Ridge City and Green Hill with dirt and swamps and the like. I did have a fair bit of trouble controlling this one in MAME for whatever reason, so you're going to admittedly see some quite hideous gameplay here, but you kind of get the idea, because this by now is Namco's bread and butter. Just as you had scalar titles like 4 Tracks and Suzuka 8 Hours, you now have 3D titles like Dirt Dash and Cybercycles. Namco put in their stamp on as many forms of racing as they can, and it's pretty much all, at the very least, decent. With all that said, in this instance Dirt Dash does rather pale in comparison to Sega Rally, and there's not a whole lot of competition between the two. Once again, there wasn't going to be a Dirt Dash 2. (1993's Numan Athletics was a very nice take on the classic old athletics genre, and happily we now have a sequel. 1995's Mach Breakers is indeed an even better rendition with even more creative events, but this one only came out in Japan. There's more athletes to choose from, and the events get even more out there. How do you fancy running through blocks of ice as if they're nothing? Or dragging a fully sized freaking Godzilla standing across a city, or jumping from a balloon in order to smash the ground as hard as possible on impact? There's a lot of fun to be had, and the way that the game's set up means that you aren't necessarily going through the same sequence of events each time you play. You can pick and choose what you do, which is nice. Mach Breakers is a pretty fabulous sequel, and even if these games aren't amongst the most successful track and field titles ever made, they're definitely amongst the best.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Namco decided to take another big look back through their extensive history with our next entry. You may recall that around this time they started releasing their Namco Museum collections for the PlayStation, bringing a bunch of their arcade classics into the home. Well, the first volume of Namco Classics Collection was released into the arcade in conjunction with Namco Museum, and it's actually quite interesting. You get 4 games in this compilation, those being Galaga, Xevious, Super Xevious and Mappy, and while the original versions of all these games are present and correct, the arcade also features special arranged versions that, in most cases, actually change quite a lot. Galaga, for instance, is not only full of new and very pretty patterns for the alien ships to go in, but also features a whole load of new power-ups for the ship, while Xevious makes a whole load of modifications, new enemies, new stages, and both of these games also feature some very cool new music, definitely something fuller than the original Xevious's catchy yet ridiculously short 4-second loop. Mappy's arrangement is also pretty good. This one concentrates on a simultaneous 2-player experience, while also adding some different mechanics, such as trapdoors. I wouldn't say that any of these arrangements are better than the originals, but there's certainly different takes on them that are quite interesting to see. While they've been re-released a couple of times here and there on different compilations, they aren't exactly the most famous entries into these respective series, that's for sure. Definitely worth looking at. In the midst of so many big and busty 3D titles that are all about the technology and the wowing and all of that, it's very nice to see something that's not just a 2D title, but one that's beautifully done, creative. Hell, one that doesn't actually have a whole lot of other games that are similar to it. 1994's Tinkle Pit was one of those, and here in 1995 we have the absolutely fantastic Outfoxies. Masaharu Umeda's game is pioneering, a fighting game but one like no other before it, where you pick one of 7 highly skilled assassins and your mission is to take out the others in stages that aren't just chock full of weapons, but also full of environmental hazards. Hell, the stage will likely be completely different by the time a match nears its end. The weapons also vary wildly. You've got everything from your standard pistols and machine guns to highly explosive bombs and rocket launchers, to the slightly sillier implements like fruit baskets and bowls of soup. There's a ridiculous amount of them. It's another game that is absolutely chock full of character while also being exceptionally playable, almost like a fighting game version of Rollin' Thunder, and criminally it was never released outside of Japan. However, it is quite an influential game indeed. While it's never been fully confirmed, a lot of people consider the Outfoxies to be a clear influence on Super Smash Bros., what with its heavy emphasis on projectiles and stages that can change dramatically mid-fight. This is an absolute beaut of an arcade. It should have been released worldwide, and it should have been a massive hit, as it's just so refreshing and different. We do have a lot of justifiably successful and excellent arcade games in this part, but none of them are quite like the Outfoxies.
Gun. Rocket launcher.
Rave Racer is one of what I suppose you could call multiple sequels to the original Ridge Racer, and despite being the full-on arcade one, is probably one of the least known of all the sequels. People would probably mention titles like the PS1 only Ridge Racer Revolution and Rage Racer over this one. As is often the case, that doesn't mean that Rave Racer is a bad game at all. It makes the usual additions that you would expect, with 2 new tracks, one in an entirely new city and another on a mountain, to go along with the classic Ridge City course. That, and you can also get new graphical sheens, control tweaks, and a force feedback wheel on the cabinet. There's not a whole lot here to dislike, and it was certainly all appreciated at the time, although if you were to just look at it today, you may not think that it's much of a sequel. It doesn't help that Rave Racer never left the arcade. A PS1 version was announced at one point in EGM, but it never ended up happening. For what it's worth, I can't say I remember seeing Rave Racer all that much back in the day. Despite the arcades at this point being absolutely packed out with 3D racing games of all sorts, this isn't one that sticks out in my memory as something I played until right now here in MAME. It is still a perfectly good entry in the Ridge Racer series, mind you. Yes, we are still on the track, although this is something a bit simpler. It's Speed Racer. This is a licensed arcade game based on Tatsuya Yoshida's manga, and this is actually one of the very last gasps of sprite scalar racing. This title uses the System FL board that also powered Final Lap R. Unfortunately, this game doesn't work well in MAME. It's chock full of graphical errors, particularly when it comes to the road surface, to the point where it is just about unplayable, especially seeing as most of the time you can't see when you have to jump. As such, I can't exactly be too critical about this. From what I can find online in the most typical of sources, this was not a popular title, and magazines like Next Generation compared it quite unfavourably to the full 3D racers that were by now all over the shop. Just to clarify as well, there is a Speed Racer game on PS1, released only a year after this. However, that is by Jalico and is totally different to this game here. Definitely one of Namco's more obscure titles from this period, and not one that tends to generate a whole lot of interest. The king is back. Allow him to reintroduce himself. Yes, it's the return of Super World Stadium. It turns out in the end that Great Sluggers, with its boring old realistically proportioned players and other such nonsense, simply wasn't going to cut it. Superworld Stadium did take a year off, but now it's firmly back, bunting all over that outfield and smashing homers right into the bullpen. And if you think it's going to have changed an awful lot over the course of its break, then you're dead wrong. The graphics do look a little better, and some things have changed a little, but generally speaking, yep, it's the same game. The same by now perfectly serviceable baseball title that I'm sure must have still happily appealed to many. And hey, that's often the nature of sports sims. Although if there is one thing that particularly pisses me off about all of these Japanese baseball games, is that I wish that over all of these years the crowds had actually managed to learn more than 2 sodding chants for these games to recreate. I mean, for heaven's sake, duh, 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 duh. Bloody hell. Once again, the really big games are coming at the end of 1995. As much as the original Tekken made a whole lot of waves, Tekken 2 was the slam dunk that established Namco's fighting game series as the new world's #1. It shipped around 40,000 arcade cabs around the world, and then proceeded to sell around 3 million copies on the PS1 in the space of a couple of years. It made David James crap at football for a time because he'd be up playing it all night, and it had queues out the arse no matter where you went. Tekken 2 is obviously a landmark. In most areas it's not a radical overhaul of what's there in the first game. Seiichi Ishii, the guy who Namco pinched from Sega after he'd helped create the original Virtua Fighter, is still in charge, although a certain Katsuhiro Hawada did work on the games from the beginning, initially only credited as voice actor for Law, Yoshimitsu and Kunimitsu. We've obviously got more polygons, and we've got more moves. There are plenty of tweaks here. Really the biggest change though is in the roster. It's not that there's a huge amount of entirely new characters in Tekken 2, but there's a whole lot more playable ones. In the original arcade game, the sub-bosses and Heihachi weren't playable at all, no matter what you did. In arcade Tekken 2, Heihachi is not only playable from the start, seeing as Kazuya is now the main boss of the franchise, but all of the sub-bosses are unlockable. Either they get unlocked through beating the corresponding character's story mode, or they appear after the machine's been on for a set amount of time. Ultimately, after weeks or indeed months of operation, you'll be able to play as everyone, from Armakin and Gunryu to the Angel and Devil Kazuya. Oh, and obviously don't forget Roger the Kangaroo. Arcade goers gradually figured out that time unlocks were a thing in this game, and they worked pretty well. As much as Tekken 2 didn't need it because it was such a juggernaut, it obviously helped maintain a lot of interest in the game. While people would generally say that Tekken 3 has aged a lot better, and they would be right, Tekken 2 is obviously a very important game indeed, and can hardly be overlooked.
You lose. Final round. Fight!
From one arcade classic, straight into another. Time Crisis is here, and it's one of my favourite arcade games of all time. I can't even tell you just how much time and money I sunk into this one back in the day, and there's no way that I couldn't pick it as my all-time favourite light gun shooter ever, simply based on that. With this out the way, Time Crisis offered a simple yet genius addition to the light gun genre, one that changed the game completely: the ability to take cover. You, super secret special elite beat agent one-man army Richard Miller, must constantly duck in and out of cover in order to not just reload, but to dodge. You certainly don't want to be out there with your head in the open forever. It's a simple enough thing, but it felt so much more dynamic than the regular time-based likes of Sega's Virtua Cop, and using that big old pedal felt so right. That and you're always against the clock. Obviously you can't stay in cover forever because you've got to take out the groups of the Wild Dog's foot soldiers as quickly as possible. It's very satisfying to cut those groups down rapidly in a blaze of fire, and it's even more enjoyable to figure out the odd shortcut or take down one of those special enemies that give you a couple more seconds. That and there's the quick rush of blood and the need to get down when there's some sort of hazard or a rocket, or one of those pink goons that are a hell of a lot more accurate than most of the game's stormtroopers. Tremendous boss fights, pumping music, the gun con. I love this game dearly. It's another one of my all-time favourites from Namco, and it was something that I played for years, basically whenever I saw it in an arcade. We've got one final game here in 1995, and it's another big 3D one with a multiplayer component. However, it is not a racing title. Tokyo Wars is actually a competitive tank game, one that's dearly loved by fans of the genre. Essentially, this is a big and busty 3D take on Battlezone, where you and up to 7 other tank pilots roam either the streets or the docks of Tokyo, firing at each other and seeing just who's going to be the last one standing. If you're just playing this on your own, then obviously that's not the complete experience. What you get is more like a little taster or a practice session where you take control of one team and the game only lasts a minute or two, as opposed to the more epic length that a multiplayer bout can go to. It is possible for a game of Tokyo Wars to last up to 15 minutes, after all. This title was hugely popular in Japan. It's got another zinger of a cabinet, especially the deluxe version where you can feel a whole bunch of recoil every time you take a shot from the cannon. It's not as well known as the previous 2 titles we've looked at, but it is a cracking arcade game. "1996 starts off with another big salvo of racing-based environmental cabs, so let's have a quick run through them. Ace Driver Victory Lap is the sequel to the first game from 1994, and it improves matters in various areas where you would expect it to. You've got better graphics, and you do have more than one track. Here we have 3 to pick from. Writing about these games can certainly get a bit repetitive, seeing as Namco do have a very set formula here. You make the first game with just a single track, and then the second game comes roaring in with a couple more tracks and a bunch of other improvements here and there. It's all good, although Ace Driver did end up getting dropped following this title. It kind of marks the end of a tradition for Namco, seeing as this is the last Formula 1 game that the company would release for 13 years, a surprise considering how much success they've had with this type of racing. Ace Driver would return in 2008 for Ace Driver 3 Final Turn, which is actually the final arcade game to be released under the regular Namco name. It's all Bandai Namco after that. Alpine Racer is also back with a sequel. Here's Alpine Racer 2. Again, this isn't exactly an easy game to play on MAME thanks to its unique controls, but it's certainly a title I remember. Everything from the big old machine to the message telling you to watch out for people behind you when you dismounted it. It's a fabulous experience in the actual arcade, but certainly not as great an experience in the home. While we're at it, we may as well cover the other Alpine game that got a release in 1996, Alpine Surfer. This is pretty much the same deal as Alpine Racer, only we're now on a snowboard instead of skis. Alpine Surfer does have a bit more of an emphasis on doing tricks, making some nice grabs when you're up in the air, grinding on rails and all of that. It's perfectly cool, although once again it has controls that are tricky to emulate. Alpine Surfer definitely got a lot of attention back when it came out, as I'm pretty sure it was the only game of its kind. I certainly don't recall any snowboarding game arriving in the arcade before this one, and certainly not one that would actually stick you on a snowboard type controller. It is all very nice, although it's much nicer if you ever get the chance to play one of these machines properly. Of all of these big environmental cabs that aren't just about cars and motorbikes though, there are 2 from Namco that are my absolute favourites. The other one is coming in a few entries' time, but here's the first, and it's Aqua Jet. This is the one I played the most. I absolutely adored this game in the arcade, riding a big old jet ski, doing all the jumps, trying to score as much as you can. Playing this in MAME, it is surprising to see just how basic it really is. As with so many of these titles, it is only one rather small course, and playing it using a gamepad does remove a lot of the challenge from the game. Still, there was a time when I would play Aqua Jet literally every time I visited the arcade, and the actual act of leaning and rocking the jet ski around certainly made the game a fair bit tougher than it appears to be if you're simply firing up the ROM. I feel like this is one of the lesser known entries into Namco's big old environmental cab canon, seeing as there's really not a whole lot of info available on it, or many people talking about it, but this is a pretty special title as far as I'm concerned.
Time extended.
We finally move on from environmental cabs, but we're moving to something that's, perhaps a little bit more risque. It's Dancing Eyes. Made by Masateru Umeda, the same man who brought us the absolutely amazing Outfoxies in 1995, Dancing Eyes falls into the same category as games like Ghoul Panic and the like, only it's in 3D. Whereas a lot of these games tend to be inspired by kicks, this is more like a 3D version of Konami's Amidar. You guide a monkey named Urusa-san around a grid, filling the squares by going over the lines, avoiding enemies and gradually revealing more of the model that's hidden inside the crate, or vase, or carton of milk or whatever. Once they're fully revealed, you'll get a bit of a dance. It should be said that Dancing Eyes isn't all about revealing scantily clad women. You get to pick what stage you would like to go to next, and if you want to do something like get a dance from a big old cow, well, you can do that. There's a lot of comedy here, and the actual game itself is pretty damn good. It's certainly a cut above most other adult games that you would find in the corners of the arcade floor. An HD remake based around the PlayStation Move could have been released in 2011, but it ended up getting cancelled for unknown reasons. Much less interesting, quite frankly, is Dunk Mania. This is a 2-on-2 3D basketball game, and to be honest, there's not a great deal to say beyond that. One thing that is worth mentioning is that both this game and the previous title, Dancing Eyes, used the Namco System 11 hardware, and that didn't necessarily mean that a port to the PlayStation was a surefire thing. Neither Dancing Eyes nor Dunk Mania left the arcade, and while that is kind of a shame in the case of Dancing Eyes, you could take or leave this one. Not that there's much wrong with it, it's just a very generic bit of 2-on-2 basketball in early 3D. It's not exactly NBA Jam, and it certainly didn't set the arcade floor on fire. Indeed, this game didn't even leave Japan. Here's another one to add to the quiz game pile. Kosodate Quiz My Angel is actually the start of a series of titles, and seeing as we'll be seeing another 2 of these in the video, we may as well just look at the whole lot now. The gimmick with these games is that they're parenting quizzes. You raise a child from the age of 0 to 25, answering questions in each year, and how well you perform determines both the amount of money you have to raise the child, as well as their personality. The second game from 1997 sees you raising twins, and the third game from 1998 adds a pet into the mix. There's also another game that spins off from these called Derby Quiz My Dream Horse. Basically the same thing, only it's a magnificent equine beast instead of a squealing little brat. If only they'd called it My Lovely Horse instead, that would have generated at least a couple of mild titters. Here is something better. It's the second volume of the Namco Classics collection. Once again, we've got 4 big titles from Namco's archives, and this one includes the biggest of the lot. We've got Pac-Man, Rally X, New Rally X, and Dig Dug here, and once again we've got arranged versions of 3 of the games to go along with the originals. As should really be the case, the arranged Pac-Man sees a lot of changes being made, and it is in fact the best of the whole lot. There's some really fabulous adjustments and tweaks that make this an excellent, much more modern game of Pac-Man, the main one of which is a new ghost called Kinky who can merge with other ghosts and give them special abilities such as dashing or cloning themselves. However, eating Kinky can also give Pac extra power, and there's a lot more to power pellets than simply being able to munch on the spectres. They can also make you dash around or jump about or create your own mirror images, all sorts, and it comes with a bunch of brand new lovely looking levels with great music. This is fantastic. Rally X and Dig Dug are also both absolutely fine. In the main, they both feature a bunch of new enemies and power-ups to go along with the all-new graphics and themes, and they're both totally decent ways to play each game. However, the Pac-Man arrangement is unquestionably where it's at. If you don't want to play it here, it is also available on a couple of compilations, including the recent Pac-Man Museum Plus from 2022. We've got a bit more in the way of mid-sports games. Here's Prime Goal EX. An odd little beast, this one. The J-League Prime Goal series started out on the SNES before moving to the PlayStation. And from what I can see, this game actually got released on the PS1 a few months before it came to the arcade. Obviously, it's usually the other way around. Rather than being completely and utterly 3D, this is one of those games that sticks 2D sprites on a 3D background. In other words, it's kind of like FIFA Soccer 96 on the 32-bit platforms, and yeah, it's pretty naff. The Prime Goal series in the home is perfectly okay, but this isn't something that works particularly well in the arcade at all. It's certainly not impressive in any way for 1996, considering that Sega's Virtua Striker had already been out for nearly 2 years by this point, so I'm not sure why this got an arcade version, honestly. Feels a bit pointless. Right, here is another absolute beauty of a title, one of the most unique and gorgeous environmental taiko cabs ever to be found in an arcade. Prop Cycle. The name of Shigeki Toyama has been mentioned a couple of times in this series. He did many great things over the years at Namco, having his hand in various landmarks, whether it be designing the original Mappy robot or the iconic Andor Genesis, aka Gafuru Cookie, mothership from Xevious, as well as his work on cabinets like Thunder Scepter, Final Lap, and the almighty Galaxian 3. Prop Cycle is something he took full direction on, and it is perhaps his masterwork. Admittedly heavily inspired by Hayao Miyazaki's Kiki's Delivery Service, you play as a boy riding around in a human-powered bike-cum-plane known as the Laporopter, improving your skills by popping balloons. There is actually a little bit of plot, something different from the arcade norm. Indeed, just about everything in Prop Cycle is different from the norm, whether it's the aim of the game or its thoroughly non-violent nature. The game is playable in MAME, although doing so does reduce the challenge of it somewhat. There's nothing at all like actually cycling on the cabinet and feeling like you're riding the wind. Everything about this stands out. The aesthetics of the title, something wonderfully pretty in a setting that is actually post-apocalyptic. It's that rarest of things, an early-ish 3D game that doesn't feel like it's aged a day. Unquestionably an arcade classic, one that simply must be played whenever the chance comes along. And here we have another all-time favourite. As awesome as the Tekken games are, I have just about as much love for Soul Edge, a legendary weapons-based fighter and obviously the start of another big series. You always remember the games that just grabbed you immediately, and this one did it right from the first time that I heard that phrase, "Welcome to the stage of history," on the Fighter Select screen. This isn't just a game that I would want to play every time I saw it in an arcade. It's a game I would want to try and finish, normally through playing pretty much exclusively as Siegfried, seeing as he had the biggest sword and therefore was obviously the best character. You can probably find some fault in that wisdom, but I did end up getting pretty decent at the game. Obviously it's got a blinder of a port on the PS1 too, one that's damn near the same thanks to the System 11 board, but I still love everything about this. Even it being a 30 FPS game doesn't feel like a particularly large hindrance, almost giving the fights a bit of a cinematic feel, especially when compared with how lovely the stages still look and the game's beautiful lighting. While admittedly the next game in the series does eclipse the original in nearly every aspect, the love that I have for Soul Edge or Soul Blade puts it way up there for me.
The grueling battle ended with the victory of Gekitou. You win!
And after all this, yes, Super World Stadium 96 is here. And yes, it's the same game as the previous Super World Stadium title. I get an image of everyone else in Namco Towers burying their heads in whopping big and heavily expensive 3D suites, working on the next big arcade, and meanwhile there's this one guy dressed up in a Yomiuri Giants uniform, absolutely 100% full kit wanker, going around the office shouting, bashing a taiko drum and doing all those bloody chants, trying to G everyone else up. He's able to do this because it took him about 5 minutes to finish the latest Super World Stadium game. Just take the old names out and stick the new ones in. It's almost endearing, actually. Our final 1996 game brings another old legend back to the fray. It's the return of Xevious. Now of course, Xevious 3DG is the series' second foray into 3 dimensions, seeing as we already had Solvaloo a few years back. This one is a more traditional affair that's in line with the original, although it would be more accurate to say that this has the sort of 3/4, slightly behind the ship view you would find in games like Sylpheed. This is a fairly likeable shooter, especially for one that's fully 3D, although age has perhaps been slightly unkind to it compared to other better titles in the field, such as, say, Taito's Raystorm. Xevious fans aren't necessarily kind to it either. For some, this one strays a bit too far from the Xevious traditions, seeing as you can do things like, well, power up your Starfighter, for a start. To me, that's the sort of complaint that does feel a little bit too stuck in the past, but there you go. That said, Xevious 3DG is pretty much a middle-of-the-pack shooter as far as Namco's concerned. It's not bad, but on the other hand, it's not particularly worth looking at. A quick note before we get properly into 1997. This year marks the introduction of some brand new Namco hardware. This right here is the System 23. It's the company's final fully custom designed board. It's capable of 2 million polygons every second. The 133 MHz CPU is over 4 times faster than the one that's in the System 22. It's a beast, for sure. Now, unfortunately, the high majority of System 23 games are still unplayable. By all accounts, it's an incredibly complicated and very unstable bit of kit, and it needs a lot more time in the woodshed. This means that unfortunately we can't really see most of these games, whether they be Downhill Bikers or Final Furlong, Rapid River or Panic Park, and so on. I am chucking a little list of System 23 games up here as a bit of a follow-on for people, because some folks on YouTube have captured footage of the titles here and there, usually direct from the board. We will at least be able to see Time Crisis 2 and Crisis Zone, thanks to both of them getting ports to the PS2. Sadly, those were the only System 23 games that did get a console port. Anywho, with that said, let's soldier on. We start off with something weird and brief. It's more quizzing. Abnormal Check is apparently some sort of quiz game based on dating, perhaps some Tokimeki Memorial type crap. I've no idea really. The odd thing about this is the general look of it and what happens to your strange looking character whenever they get a question 1. They get completely wrecked, electrocuted, taken off by a bird, their head explodes. That's certainly something. An odd quizzer to be sure. You might get a kick out of it, so long as you know the lingo. Armadillo Racing here is pretty much a novelty title, one that's more than likely aimed at the younger set. This is a very simple and very short game where you control your armadillo with the aid of a trackball, bashing it along and ideally finishing ahead of your opponents. However, you need to be slightly careful. You can't go too hard, otherwise your heart rate will go too high and you'll end up getting a heart attack. Because, well, the game said so. A straightforward little thing that comes in a nice cabinet, essentially an average bit of Game Centre fodder. There's not too much to say, really. So, here's the first proper game from 1997 we can look at, and it's Ehrgeiz, God Bless the Ring. There are several reasons why you likely know this game, the main one being that it features characters from Final Fantasy VII. Here in the arcade version that Namco published, you can eventually select Cloud and Tifa, although sadly they are time-based unlocks, while the Square published PS1 version added in Sephiroth, Zack, Yuffie and Vincent. The game itself is by Dream Factory, the new studio headed up by Seiichi Ishii, the guy who headed up design on the original Virtua Fighter, Tekken 1 and Tekken 2. So that's the connection between all three companies here. Dream Factory also made Tobal on PS1 for Square, so there's that. That is a whole lot of intro for a fighting game that, in the end, doesn't work massively well in my opinion. Ehrgeiz has a little bit going for it with its full movement, as well as the items it chucks at you and all the variation in the stages, and I will always have a soft spot for a game that features such a clear and glorious Antonio Inoki homage, but it's just not that much fun when it comes to the actual fighting, especially when compared to all the other Namco gems in this genre. Looking at this, I think it's a bit of shame that the Tobal series didn't get a chance to come to the arcade. Those games are, to me, a great deal more appealing, both in terms of gameplay and Akira Toriyama's art. We are back into the world of sports, but we do have something wildly different. It's Libero Grande. This is the football game that puts you in charge of just one player, a mechanic that Namco actually used previously in a 1992 Famicom licensed game based off of the Top Striker anime series. You pick one of various individuals that are clearly based on real-life players such as Zinedine Zidane, Alan Shearer, Hidetoshi Nakata, Carlos Valderrama and so on, pick a country and away you go. Aside from on-the-ball stuff, you're handling off-the-ball actions such as calling for a pass, encouraging teammates to shoot, making sure you're staying in the right zones. To me, this is a damn fine game. It's certainly different to the football norm, and eventually the big football games would have their own modes that put you in charge of a single player. However, I think that the slower pace of Libero Grande doesn't make it very suitable for the arcade. To me, this is a title that works a hell of a lot better when played on the PS1, away from arcade constrictions such as having to have a much shorter time limit and so on. It's definitely recommended on PlayStation though. Back then it was a thoroughly refreshing experience. The annoying thing about not being able to look at System 23 titles is that, unfortunately, it seems like we miss out on a lot of the more major releases. To me, I don't feel like I can really say much about a game if I can't actually play it. Instead, we get curios like this, Pocket Racer, which is another version of Ridge Racer. Now, Ridge Racer may be quite old by this point, and this is actually based on the PS1 version with the frame rate to match, but this is something that's more aimed at children. It's got a little mini cabinet, and the game's cars have been replaced by Choro-Q style toys, all super deformed and what have you. Other than that, the game plays exactly like PS1 Ridge Racer, and clearly this only came out in Japan. If the full-scale Ridge Racer cabinet is at one end of the arcade scale, then this is most certainly on the other end, but it is still an amusing little variation. Here's something a trifle unexpected. Namco pairs up with Ehrgeiz and we get an arcade wrestling game as a result. This is Shin Nihon Pro Wrestling Tukon Retsuden 3, a series that's mostly on PlayStation. But here we've got an arcade edition of the officially licensed New Japan game, complete with plenty of their biggest stars: Shinya Hashimoto, Masahiro Chono, Jushin Liger, Great Muta, all sorts. Tukon Retsuden 3 is a pretty damn good wrestling game. In the West, we only ever saw this series once, when the original got a release as Power Move Pro Wrestling, but the wrestling here feels very natural and fluid for being still quite an early 3D game. After all, we are still at a time when the almighty Aki were finding their feet in the genre. I am not totally sure why this one did get an arcade version, and I do feel that, much like Libero Grande, the Tukon Retsuden games are best experienced in the home. This is definitely a wrestling game that leans more towards simulation than arcade action, after all. But it is still amusing to see this game in an arcade setting. If you can believe it, it's Super World Stadium time again. It's 1997, and goddammit, it's still here, and it's still the same. Other people in Namco Towers are screwing around with monster arcade boards with triple-digit speed CPUs. This is still rocking the Namco NB1, powered by the nearly 15-year-old Motorola 68EC020. You gotta love it by this point. I've completely turned around on Super World Stadium, and am thoroughly invested in the series, just resolutely, bullheadedly going absolutely freaking nowhere whatsoever. Sod it, just release the same game forever. Let's make it to Super World Stadium 24, and we'll still have the same two tunes hammering into everyone's eardrums. Hell yeah! "1997 has felt a bit like a minor year, especially without being able to really look at the likes of Final Furlong or Rapid River, which, make no mistake, were pretty damn popular games. I mean, who couldn't love Final Furlong? It plunked you onto a horse and didn't give two shits what happened to you after that. But all is not lost, for here we have another one of the most important games. The first two Tekkens were already pretty damn great, but Tekken 3 is another matter. Hell, for a lot of people, it's kind of where the series starts now. The difference between Tekken 2 and Tekken 3 may not be quite as marked as the difference between, let's say, Street Fighter 1 and Street Fighter 2, but it's where just about all the other essential pieces fall into place, and Namco created something that is immediately and unquestionably one of the greatest fighting games ever made. That and this is, of course, the game where, following the departure of Seiichi Ishii to form Dream Factory, Katsuhiro Hawada takes centre stage as designer and director, the man who would become synonymous with basically all things King of Iron Fist. We've got tons of improvements here, of course. We've got big graphical leaps thanks to the brand new System 12 hardware, a hefty improvement on the old PlayStation-esque System 11. And on the gameplay front, we've got the thoroughly advanced movement. There's all the sidesteps and what have you, something that totally changes the feel of Tekken, and for the better. Another quite notable change in the arcade for this one was that Namco actually made the game a lot less difficult. The AI in the first two Tekken games was absolutely brutal, barely giving human players an inch and reading all sorts of inputs. Here it's been seriously toned down, actually allowing players to get some nice practice in and win a good few matches before taking on other people, which is, after all, what most people really want out of Listen. Between all of these changes, a whole load of excellent brand new characters, and a serious load of Iron Fist lore with the new tournament that takes place 15 years after the previous one, all the great music, and of course, the absolutely incredible port that the game would get to the PS1, something that executives at Namco initially didn't think was possible to pull off. This is one of Namco's definitive titles, without a doubt. The sales alone, over 30,000 arcade cabs and 8 million copies on PS1, kinda speak for themselves there. One of the best fighting games ever. Indeed, one of the best games ever. I have one extra little bit of Tekken in this year. In fact, I've got a bunch of little medal betting games that can be played on MAME, spanning from 1996 to 1999. I thought this was a nice place to go through them. First off, there's a couple of Pac-Man based video slot machines from 1996, Pac Slot and Pac 8. These are simple enough slot machines. I prefer the first one generally, as I like the effect of the ghosts messing around with the display. When you win in these games, you also get a chance to double your winnings by, for example, making a choice between Pac-Man or Ms. Pac-Man. 1997 and 1998 would see two Tekken games in this vein, Tekken Card World and Tekken Battle Scratch. In Card World, you roll the dice with each credit and hopefully land Roger on a card containing a character. If you do, you'll then gradually fight against other Tekken opponents in another random dice battle, again deciding with each successful bout if you want to double your winnings or pay out. Battle Scratch is pretty similar. Two fighters get picked randomly, you choose which box to scratch, and whoever has the highest value wins. Not much else to it. If you want a fuller card-based Tekken experience, I suppose I should mention Tekken Card Challenge, a 1999 game for the WonderSwan that's kind of like an Iron Fist take on Pokemon battles. Finally, we have Tobikose Jumpman from 1999. Here you pick something for our hero to jump over, and there is a bit of timing involved when it comes to hitting go on the springboard, although I presume that the actual jump is random. Again, you can double the height of the jump if you're successful. Simple as that, really. These are all available in MAME, so I thought I should include them. "1998 begins with a couple of quite obscure titles. Attack Pla-Rail here is another Japanese-only affair. This is a train game in a similar vein to Taito's long-running Densha Digo series. However, this is also based off of a line of toys from Tomy, and so the aesthetic here is considerably less realistic than you would find in a Densha Digo game. The controls are quite similar here to what you would find in Taito's titles, and I have admittedly only played Densha Digo a couple of times before. That said, it's not like there's a lot of controls in those games, so they are not that hard to pick up. This is a bit more challenging when it comes to figuring out what exactly needs to be done, although admittedly a lot of that is due to the language barrier. That and the battery life of the train does run out pretty sharpish, although I am not versed in the art of making it last longer, or getting more batteries. If you like train games, I do suppose that this is a bit of an alternative to the bigger titles out there. Here's another lesser-known title. Surprisingly, it's a fighting game, although Namco only published this one. Fighting Layer, as far as I can tell, only came out in Japan and only in the arcades, and as far as 3D fighters go, this is definitely more in the Street Fighter vein as opposed to the Tekken vein. Mind you, that shouldn't be a surprise. This title was developed by Arika, makers of the Street Fighter EX series for Capcom, and Fighting Layer is essentially an original fighting game that plays a lot like those titles. Indeed, two of Arika's original creations for EX, Alan Snyder and Blair Dame, both end up here in Fighting Layer. I'm not a huge fan of Street Fighter EX, but I can take the gameplay a lot better in an original title. This is a very decent fighter indeed, one that appears to be easy enough to learn the basics of, while adding a few other little tricks like a charge meter and whatnot. To be honest, with 3D fighters being so big at the time, I am kind of surprised that Fighting Layer didn't see any release outside of Japan, nor any kind of home port either. Maybe this is down to some sort of issue between Namco and Capcom due to the similarity of this game to the Street Fighter EX titles? Not sure, maybe. Annoyingly, a couple more prominent System 23 titles aren't available here. While Panic Park is unlikely ever to be playable in something like MAME, seeing as the whole point of the title is to move a massive joystick around and physically barge into your human counterpart, it would at least be amusing to try and emulate it. Still, we do have another very big title here to make up for it, one where once again we are welcomed to the stage of history. Soul Calibur is another one where it's hard to know where to start. As brilliant as the first game was, Namco once again managed to make one of the greatest fighting game sequels of all time, and only a year after Tekken 3. The increased speed and full frame rate are amongst the more notable improvements, but then of course you have the full 8-way run movement, the exceptional combos, the absolute beauty of the graphics. There's a lot here. They took the floorboards up for this sequel, make no mistake. The port here is also notable, albeit in a way that is not necessarily good for the arcades. The original Soul Calibur is certainly getting the absolute most out of the System 12 hardware it's running on, and the all-time classic 1999 port to the Dreamcast was actually an improvement in all departments, including performance, where the Dreamcast utterly outstrips the arcade. More people probably think of Listen as a Dreamcast game first, before they think of the original arcade version, but either way, this is another absolutely brilliant fighting game that's going to establish Soul Calibur in the Namco canon for a long time to come. Folks, I have some big news. We have reached Super World Stadium 98, and at long last, here in the game's 11th incarnation, it has gone 3D. It happened. But don't fret so much, and don't be afraid. This is still the baseball action that you are utterly used to, only with polygons. Now in all seriousness, Super World Stadium actually does make a pretty good transition to the 3D realm. I think I actually prefer the game this way. Part of the reason for that is because it does add a couple of different teams as opposed to the usual recreations of real-life Japanese baseball outfits. I'll save possibly the coolest one for the next instalment, but here for example it is now possible to play as a ladies team. Oh, and don't worry, they can happily twat the ball around just as hard as the Yomiuri Giants or the Hanshin Tigers or whoever. Anyway, it's a perfectly okay bout of baseball, and I am happy at least that the soundtrack has also changed to feature more of a crowd as opposed to the same damned chants over and over again. Here's a bit of a landmark. Techno Drive is actually the last Namco Racing game that we're going to be seeing in this series. Shocking, I know. While these games haven't necessarily stood out lately, Techno Drive does stand out by being completely different. This isn't so much a racing game as it is a futuristic driving license simulator, a title where you have to complete a handful of tests based around steering, footwork and practical applications, ranging from the more standard art of keeping the car inside the cones to trying to keep a bowl of liquid steady and not losing too much of it. It's all quite novel, and it does come in a very stylised package, trippy visuals and pumping music. My controls for this game in MAME aren't configured well at all, but I still had a lot of fun here. If you were to play this in its regular arcade cab form, you would also end up with a printout of your results, complete with final grade, which is nifty. Anyway, if you ever wanted to see how you could actually get a ton of fun out of Gran Turismo's endless license tests, then Techno Drive is the game you're looking for. And here's another serious hidden gem title. This one's so damn good, and such a great concept, I almost struggle to believe that it never left either Japan or the arcade. Briefly summed up, Tenkomori Shooting is a lot like Point Blank, but the focus is on classic vertical shoot-'em-up action, as opposed to light gun gameplay. You have all of these various tasks to complete, quotas to meet, and seconds to do them in, and it's wonderful. The Point Blank formula works brilliant in a game like this, and there's lots of different levels to pick from. Obviously you're going to get the odd level that's based on a Namco classic like Xevious or Galaxian, but there's plenty of kookier stuff on offer too, whether it's firing hearts at your love on a stage, or defending rice bags from crows that are looking to pick them up and fire lethal bird droppings at you. This is an outstanding little arcade, and frankly I cannot believe that this game isn't better known. It's the perfect marriage of classic shoot-'em-up gameplay with one of Namco's most engaging and enduring arcade ideas. Go and play this one immediately. And here's Time Crisis 2. This is a System 23 game, and although it is actually kind of sort of playable-ish in MAME, I thought it best to demonstrate this one by using its port to PS2. The HUD gets a bit of an overhaul here, and the graphics are definitely improved from the arcade, but the game is much the same. In a lot of ways, Time Crisis 2 is more of the same aside from one crucial addition. We've got another all-important secret mission starring elite secret agents, and the keyword there is agents. Time Crisis 2 is now a two-player game, where you get to work together with a colleague, taking on those bad guys from two angles, and obviously trying not to shoot each other. The PS2 version even allows you to unlock a 2 light guns mode, which is obviously something you could do in the arcades if you didn't mind a ridiculous level of challenge, just because you wanted to feel like Chow Yun-Fat or whatever. There's a few little changes to the gunplay. You are able to unlock different limited weapons at points, such as a machine gun or a shotgun, and another big change is that you get to see when the enemy is just about to hit you, giving you a split second to quickly take cover. Not so short that you still don't have any hope of dodging, but not so long that it's easy. This actually helps quite a lot in making Time Crisis's gameplay that little bit more reactive. Unsurprisingly, this is an absolute smasher of a sequel if you've got even the slightest bit of love for the original. Well, we finally made it to 1999, the last year that we're looking at. And just what do Namco have for us here? Happily, a lot of games we can cover, and a lot of really damn good ones, starting with the utterly fabulous Aqua Rush. Again, I don't believe that this game ever left Japan, and it really should have. Aqua Rush is a superb looking and playing Tetris style puzzler, one where the well is actually upside down and you've already got formations of lines coming at you. The idea is to clear them as quickly as possible by firing those puzzle pieces up at them. It's sort of like the old Konami arcade puzzle game Block Hole, or Quarth, but this is a great deal better. The sort of puzzler that really gets your heart racing, especially because it doesn't take long for things to start moving really fast. If you're able to remain composed under such pressure, then you'll do well here. Another not very well known Namco game that deserves a load more recognition. Crisis Zone, on the other hand, is definitely one of the better known titles from this period. It's another very good light gun shooter, and once again, I'm showing this game using the PlayStation 2 version from 2004. Now, while this version is in many ways a total remake and nothing like the arcade looks-wise, the original arcade sadly isn't playable at all in MAME. At least it can be featured here using this version. Crisis Zone is a spin-off of Time Crisis, with the twist being that you are now firing a machine gun, and instead of taking cover behind objects and walls, you have a riot shield that you go behind, so you're always on the move. Your riot shield is several orders stronger than the cheap and shitty ones that some of your enemies use that tend to fall apart after a few shots, so don't feel too worried about taking cover behind it whenever you need to. The constant movement in this game does help matters, making the game feel a fair bit faster than regular old Time Crisis, and the setting allows for a whole lot more environmental destruction, which, again, is very welcome. This 2004 remake does have a bit more of a sci-fi aesthetic going for it, which does look nice in its own way. I do personally prefer the less robotic look of the original Mind, and it's a shame that there's currently no way of playing that, as far as I can tell, without the original cab. Still a great shooter though. And here's some more shooter action. We've got a second Point Blank game to come in a couple of entries' time, but here we have a spin-off that not only gives us a 3D take on the classic game's casual shooter action, but also properly ties the series in with its spiritual predecessor, the classic ticket arcade shooter Golly Ghost. Here's Ghoul Panic. This title was actually developed by Ryzen as opposed to being made in-house, but the point-blank formula is utterly present and correct. You play as two ghost hunters named Lisa and Kevin, who are also cats, and you make your way through the different levels of a haunted mansion by completing the various challenges, shooting ghosts in a specific pattern, avoiding the bomb ghosts, accuracy-based stuff like shooting the little ghosts off of a sleeping cat. There's also a bunch of boss fights added into the mix, so there's plenty to be getting on with, really. Once again, this is damn fine stuff if you enjoy this type of game, and lots of people do. So whether you play this either on the arcade or on the PlayStation, where it's pretty much the same, this is a lovely little shooting gallery. And here we've got another shooting gallery game. Well, of a sort, anyway. This is Golgo 13, and it's also by Rising, another game that didn't leave Japan. This is, of course, a title based on the adventures and missions of Duke Togo, or Golgo 13, the legendary assassin himself, star of a manga that's been continuously published since 1968, and emotionless emissary of death. As you might expect, a Golgo 13 game is all about accuracy and all about presentation. You get a lot of plot before each actual mission, all of which comes in lovingly done manga panel form. I would assume that these storylines are based off of panels from the manga's rich history as opposed to being entirely original, although I am not sure about that. And then you get the mission itself. Togo takes that single shot at his target, no matter where they are. They could be at the top of a building, taking off in an airplane, it could be a missile that's launching. It doesn't matter, because nothing and no one is safe. You don't have an energy meter so much as you have an accuracy meter that gradually goes down depending on how precise you are. The game doesn't end until you hit 0. Now obviously this loses a lot in MAME, especially if you're just clicking a mouse like I am here. This is all about the cabinet, which features a full recreation of Togo's signature scoped M16 rifle, complete with magnifying lens. I can't knock this one at all, I must say. Once again, it's a wonderfully novel idea for an arcade, and beautifully faithful to its source material. We take a quick break from shooting action for another absolute gem of a puzzle game. Indeed, it's the start of another very popular and very successful series of titles. Here's the original Mr. Driller, spiritual successor to the legendary Dig Dug, and a title that came out of nowhere even for most folks in Namco Towers. This is one of those puzzlers that's perfect for constantly having one more go at. You play as Susumu, and you need to try and dig down as far as you possibly can, avoiding the blocks that may fall on you, and setting up columns-esque chain reactions, and also making sure you keep your air supply totted up. It's simple stuff compared to the fancy 3D games we've been seeing lately, and it ended up catching a fair bit of fire. Mr. Driller's old school charm and beauty made it a big success firstly in the arcade and then over various home versions. It's perfect casual fun, the sort of game where there's no way that you could ever possibly get away with playing it just once. Even when you fail, you simply have to have another crack at it. It didn't take long for more Mr. Driller titles to follow this original, and the series is still going today. We stay in the land of bright colours and 2D fun for one last shooting game, and it's Point Blank 2, hitting the arcades 5 years after the original. As a matter of fact, the original Japanese release of the game, Gunball, happened in 1998 on the PS1, with the arcade version then coming out a few months later. This is something that would become a little more common for Namco, seeing as they also released an arcade version of Sony's Jammer Lammy this year, months after the PS1 version but complete with guitar-based controls that are similar to the game Guitar Jam, that we can't cover here. Regardless of what this means for the arcade going forward, Point Blank 2 is another highly welcome bout of blasting and performing silly challenges. The formula hasn't exactly changed an awful lot, but then it didn't really need to. It's still one of the best gun games around. While mechanical shooting galleries obviously usually can't be recreated in MAME, the brilliance of Point Blank means that's not a huge deal at all, as every stage in this game gives you a crack at a new one, and the experience just doesn't get old at all. Happy days are here again, because we've got another wrestling title. After years of working closely with Sony, the end of the decade would see Namco getting closer with their old mates at Sega. You've got the Dreamcast exclusive port of Soul Calibur hitting the shelves this year, and now we've got Namco releasing arcade games on Sega's Naomi hardware. This is Toucan Retsuden 4 by Yuke's, the final entry in their New Japan-based series of games. Again, this is an arcade edition of the original Dreamcast release, although we're just playing the Dreamcast version here. Easier. As this is Yuke's last game before getting the big old WWF license and presiding over SmackDown, it's certainly possible to spot similarities between this title and that first SD game on PS1. In fact, if you ever wanted to play a WWF SmackDown game on Dreamcast for whatever reason, this is pretty close. The gameplay isn't a whole lot different from the previous Toucan Retsuden or any other game in the series, although the graphics are nicer and the game is speedier. And of course, you can still play as all your favourite New Japan wrestlers. It's still kind of a questionable arcade title, but it is a very good wrestling game. Before we close things out, we do have one last visit to that big old diamond. Super World Stadium 1999, the second 3D instalment. Shockingly, there have been a couple of changes between the first 3D title and this one. In the main, we've now got a full 60 FPS frame rate, which is always nice to see. The baseball action itself is, of course, not a whole lot different, although I appreciate that the game is a little bit kookier now that it's gone 3D. Here I'm playing with a team that's made up entirely of Namco All-Stars. You should be able to make out various folks such as Heihachi, Paul Phoenix, Kuma and others, and there's also a bunch of Namco folks in the Gals team. This is at least a little amusing. You'll undoubtedly be dying to know that there are a couple more instalments in the Super World Stadium series. The final one, Super World Stadium 2001, shockingly, came out in 2001. And so we come to the final game of this video, and the final game of this whole series. And it is perhaps appropriate that this whole thing finishes with another Tekken title. Not necessarily an entry into the main series, but a very important and successful spin-off. Tekken Tag Tournament. Tag-based fighting had been kicking around for a good while thanks to Capcom and what have you, although Tekken's take offers up a few twists, the main one being that only one member of a team has to be fully defeated to end a round, as opposed to both of them. The speedy nature of Tekken and the fact that a particularly lethal combo can virtually cut an opponent down to nothing in a flash means that your finger's never going to be too far away from the tag button. You don't necessarily get as much time with a character as you would in something like a Marvel vs. Capcom game. Damn near everyone who was featured in the first 3 Tekken titles is available to play here, with only a few exceptions like Dr. Boskonovich and the licensed Gon. As is the norm in the arcades, a lot of the characters become available over the time that the machine is on. Again though, this is a game that's probably thought of in the main as a PlayStation title rather than an arcade game, specifically PlayStation 2. The PS2 version of Tekken Tag Tournament does feature upgraded graphics from the arcade, and it was a launch title for the console in the West. It is about here where it's a good idea to draw a line, and not just because this is the last Namco arcade game of the 20th century, alphabetically in 1999 anyway. Obviously it gets even more challenging to show all of Namco's arcades from a year. We've already had to miss out a whole load of System 23 titles, and that sort of thing's going to continue. And of course, the arcades are gradually changing, becoming less about video games. We've already looked at titles which came out in the home before hitting the arcade, or got versions in the home that were technically better than the arcade, something that previously would have been unthinkable. And so, after looking at hundreds of titles and a little over 20 years of Namco's arcade history, this feels like a pretty good place to stop. It's been a wonderful journey of discovery, hopefully one that you've enjoyed watching as much as I've enjoyed making, and hopefully one that's helped you discover a bunch of new games to play. But, until the next time, bye for now.